Okay, we now turn to the Van Til readings in section 4.5. And the first one is given the title by Bahnsen, God's Mind is Incomprehensible. And these are taken from various selections from Introduction to Systematic Theology in kind of a helter-skelter way. It starts on page 205 of that book, then works its back 10 or 20 pages at a time in different snippets to eventually reaching 164. Then it starts to move forward in the book again, ending back up at finally at page 184. So it's kind of a big chiasm. And I think this was Bahnsen's attempt to make this reading more approachable, because it is, I find it to be quite difficult, somewhat obscure. However, after going through it a number of times, I think I can write down a model to represent what Van Til is trying to do in this section that will make it more approachable. And that is, he's contrasting the Christian view, or what he calls the Christian view of knowledge, which rests on a fundamental dualism of the creator and creature, and basically is showing that all alternatives to that model end up being what he calls monistic. In other words, basically a single type of knowledge with identity with man's mind. And part of what makes the reading difficult is that part of the time he's expounding the model, and you might say declaring the model, and other times he's giving arguments for this or that piece of the model. And so it's not always clear unless you keep trying to think, like, is this an argument or is he just explaining? So the dualism that he's insisting on as the basis for knowledge, I'll show here as the creator-creature, where the creature, of course, includes both man, me, and you, and all men, thinkers, and everything else in our world, the universe, the stars, the starry host of heavens, the frogs, trees, lakes, land, all of it. And the model is that we have no knowledge of the creator and thus of anything without revelation. So God reveals himself, and because of that revelation, man has knowledge, or penetrates into the mind of God. And that penetration into the mind of God is what gives him access both to who God is and what the world is. And that knowledge of the world and of God, in both cases, that knowledge is partial yet true. Similarly, he's going to argue that all other models than what he calls the Christian model basically erases the creator. So he calls that monism, because everything is going to now hinge around the mind of man. Now, this takes many forms, but all of them are a negation of this model here. So the Christian model I call dualism because of this radical creator-creature distinction, but it's not dualism in the way of other dualism, such as Platonic dualism. So this lower monistic view gets stuck with various dualisms because of its faulty foundation. And this can take many forms, one of which would be atheism, but certainly not limited to atheism. It could take the form of a Neoplatonic creation as an emanation of God, Or it could have a view where God is basically just like us, only a bigger fish. Big fish models, such as process theology, would be one, where God is just like us, only much, much bigger, you know. I think part of the aggressiveness with which Van Til attacks Gordon Clark's view is that he thinks Gordon Clark's model is a form of the big fish model. God is the same as our mind, only just much, much bigger. And he thinks this is going to be fatal to the Christian proclamation. Deism, pantheism, all the other isms. Because with deism, you have a transcendent God, but he's so transcendent that he might as well not exist. If he doesn't reveal himself, all we have is our thoughts about an abstraction of our own minds. And so it's again monistic, because boiling down to just man's thoughts. Maybe he thinks God exists and has certain attributes that we can kind of sleuth out. Or maybe he just thinks that it's unknown if there's a God or not. Different forms like that. He would put neo-orthodoxy, I think, in the same category, because there again you have God as the holy other, and also Paul Tillich. In other words, 20th century forms of both liberalism and neo-orthodoxy posit God as the holy other who freely bridges that gap, but the part that bridges is again sleuthed out, sussed out by our own minds. And so, in effect, you have the absent God plus the God of our own imagination. So it's again going to be a form of monism. Just put an X up there just to keep the structure the same. So with that sort of schemata for how to understand this passage, let me jump down to the fourth paragraph on page 246 of this section. In the Christian doctrine of the incomprehensibility of God, the creator-creature distinction is made fundamental. In the non-Christian view, this is not the case. The non-Christian view is monistic. For the Christian, this distinction implies that the triune God, as he has from all eternity existed, apart from any relationship to the universe of space and time, is wholly sufficient to himself in his being and knowledge. It implies, therefore, that God is wholly knowable and wholly known to himself. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. So the point he makes here that I failed to mention in the model is that the dualism that what I'm calling a dualism between the creator and creature is only a dualism from our standpoint. But you can also erase the creature, God without creation, and he's wholly self-contained within himself. And we can talk about God as he is in himself, apart from creation. In that case, there's no dualism. There's still the one and the many because of the plurality of persons, but there's no dualism. So it's not an ultimate dualism. This is a relative dualism. Continuing. The orthodox idea of the creator-creature distinction involves further the idea that the world of space and time has been brought into existence by the forth-putting of God's power, by creation out of nothing, by the mere exercise of his will, and not as a necessity of his being. So the view that there was a necessity for God to create is typical of what's called a Neoplatonic view, where there's emanations that just emanate from God. So he doesn't, through an act of the will, do something. He really, in a sense, has to emanate by his metaphysical character. And so the creation is, in a sense, depending on how orthodox the proponent would be, either a part of God or not a part of God, but kind of thrown out from God's being as a sort of intermediate emanation. And Van Til is pointing out that all such views as that are going to put you back down here again, because now you have the univocal continuity between the mind of God and the mind of man. Thus, there is no power of any sort operative in the course of the history of the world as man knows it that is not, without any qualification, under the control and direction of God. For to admit that anything happens outside the will of God is to admit the pagan notion of chance. God, by his plan, controls whatsoever comes to pass. So there he's picking up a theme that the absolute control of all things by God is necessary to avoid the monism, because if you have bits and pieces of the universe that are sort of out of his control, that's what he calls the pagan view of chance. And by chance, I think what he's simply highlighting is that what else is there? In other words, if there's God and his emanation, or however you want to monistically model the creation, if there's chunks that kind of where things can happen apart from his control, there's no principle of sufficient reason to understand that other than just chance, and not a chance that is governed even by God's own delimitation of random events, as it were, but truly random. And in that case, you would lose your ability to know the universe. Science would not be possible, for example. So there's hidden little arguments nested in onto some of these assertions that are all trying to undergird the thesis here that without this model, you end up with a monism that's not able to account for our knowledge. Continuing. Without the presupposition of God's revelation to man, there could be no predication of God at all. God would be not incomprehensible, but inapprehensible. Again, making the point that unless God reveals himself, he's in a sense totally hidden from us. So in that sense, the Neo-Orthodox are right. But we would not even apprehend God, let alone have him in an incomprehensible way. So what he's trying to show here, what he wants the coin to drop here, is that God is apprehended because of his revelation, and the nature of that revelation implies this model of incomprehensibility, namely this creator-creature distinction. Continuing in the middle of the page, skipping a few lines. Man must know himself or anything else in the created universe in relation to the self-contained God. Unless he can know God exhaustively, he cannot know anything else exhaustively. And of course, he can't know God exhaustively. And Van Til is arguing that therefore we can't know the creation exhaustively either. Continuing, it is only if these 2 points be taken together, the fact that man knows something about everything, including the very essence of God, and on the other hand, that he does not know anything exhaustively, that the doctrine of the incomprehensibility of God can be seen for what it is. The punchline being that we can't know anything unless it's in terms of this model. So we do know things about God, even in his essence, and about the world due to his revelation. But we don't know either God or the creation exhaustively. Continuing. In the first place, it is possible in this way to see that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man coincide at every point, in the sense that always and everywhere man confronts that which is already fully known or interpreted by God. So again, God's knowledge vouchsafes that knowledge by which we reach out from ourselves to actually know things about the real world is only possible because it's on this foundation. And the foundation is both that which God has revealed about himself, which allows us to backfill the regulative principle, you might say, of empirical and scientific knowledge, but also just the fact that God is there and is the creator and therefore knows all things. So metaphysically, that knowledge exists and is possible. It's attainable. Continuing. The point of reference cannot but be the same for man as for God. There is no fact that man meets in any of his investigation where the face of God does not confront him. On the other hand, in this way it is possible to see that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of man coincide at no point, in the sense that in his awareness of meaning of anything, in his mental grasp or understanding of anything, man is at each point dependent upon a prior act of unchangeable understanding and revelation on the part of God. The form of the revelation of God to man must come to man in accordance with his creaturely limitations. This is true with respect to every bit of revelation that God gives to man. Accordingly, the fact that man is given more and ever more revelation of God does not tend to reduce the incomprehensibility of God. For man, any new revelational proposition will enrich in meaning any previously given revelational proposition. But even this enrichment does not imply that there is any coincidence, that is, identity of content, between what God has in his mind and what man has in his mind. If there is no identity of content in the first proposition that God gives to man, there can be no identity of content attained by means of any number of additional propositions of revelation that God gives to man. Here is definitely a polemic against the Gordon Clark team assertion that really the only difference between a proposition that's known to be true by us and that proposition known to be true by God is that God also has additional propositions. Van Til is arguing here that no, if you can't get to first base with the first proposition, it's not going to help to add more because they all are suffering from the same qualitative problem that he's outlining. Bahnsen adds footnote 206. Bahnsen says, "This is an awkward and easily misunderstood statement. It could be better expressed like this. If man's mind does not become identical with God's mind, achieving mental identity of content, with regard to the first proposition revealed by God to man, it will not do so with additional revealed propositions." Skipping 10 or 20 lines here. To state clearly can mean nothing but to explain exhaustively, unless one presupposes the doctrine of revelation. It is our contention that without stating clearly, i.e., exhaustively, man can yet truly know the meaning of a proposition. So I think this is also a counter to Gordon Clark's team, because Gordon Clark was always asking his opponents to, can you please just state clearly what your premises are? Can you state clearly what your position is? And here Van Til is claiming that the demand to state clearly metaphysically implies exhaustively, because otherwise, if it's not exhaustive, there's still going to be regions that still need further clarification, and therefore it's not clear. This is an aspect, I think, of the premise that all truth is systematic truth. So you can't just pull one proposition out and state it clearly in this rigorous sense. Of course, this is not to deny that we should try to be clear and define our terms as best as possible and so forth. But it's a denial that you can achieve crystalline clarity or metaphysical clarity identical to God's clarity simply by using the right words or something of that nature. So he's kind of tried to kick out two of the struts of the Gordon Clark team's position. That one, you don't help the matters by adding more and more propositions, and two, you also don't get there by demanding that it should be stated clearly. If truth is really thought of as dependent upon God, then we are back to the Christian method. Then we cannot at the same time maintain the exact identity of content as between the mind of man and the mind of God. For the truth then comes to man exclusively by revelation, as noted above. It is God, by an eternal intuition knowing himself, who reveals himself. Man has no approach to the knowledge of the nature of God, on which truth is admittedly dependent, except by the self-conscious activity of God as expressed in revelation. And this revelation is a revelation about the manner of God's knowing, or it is not a revelation about God at all. I found that sentence confusing when he says the revelation must be about the manner of God's knowing, since on the Bahnsen frame model, this whole point is to say that the manner of God's knowing is exactly what's different from man's manner of knowing and more or less opaque to us. To be cognizant of the way that God knows, you would have to be God. But here he says that that manner of knowing is part of the revelation of God. But I think what he is saying here is not that we could certainly never achieve clarity or full cognizance of the manner of God's knowing, but rather just the fact that God knows as creator is the part of what's revealed to us. So in other words, the revelation carries with it, in a sense, this model of God as the creator, who therefore knows all things and knows them differently than we know them. And hence, by revealing himself as the creator, he's revealing his manner of knowing, it kind of, you might say, in a formal sense. Continuing. God's nature is self-conscious activity. Only on this basis is there an identity of reference point. By the way, this term reference point is used a number of times in this passage, and it's odd to me that neither Bahnsen nor Van Til defines it. So I did a Google search, and according to the AI summary of philosophical literature out there, the reference point either means the Fregean definition of the truth, but that's certainly not what Van Til is tapping into. But the other way it's used in the philosophical literature is that which makes a proposition true. So the reference point is that which makes a proposition true. And so what he's saying is that we share with God the reference point of the proposition, namely that which makes it true, that being God's declaration that it's true. God makes it true by creating it. On this basis, man may know the proposition that 2 times 2 is 4 as part of the system of knowledge that is God's. Thus only is there identity of reference point, i.e. that which makes the proposition true, between man's knowledge and God's knowledge. Only thus can man know truly without knowing exhaustively. In this next paragraph, he will illustrate or reiterate this point both with respect to the knowledge of God and the knowledge of the universe, that each of them is true but partial. First full paragraph on page 249. Therefore, when God tells me something that pertains directly to his own being apart from the world, I may repeat on the level of my experience the words that he has spoken. When he, for instance, tells me that he has existed from all eternity before the foundation of the world, I may repeat his words and say, God is eternal, but it is evident that God has, and I have not, grasped fully what God means. God knows himself exhaustively, and I know him truly, but not exhaustively. Moreover, what holds true of things that God tells me about himself holds true of everything God tells me about myself or the world. Even of the things that I observe with my senses, with respect to the things that you are accustomed to speaking of as belonging to the realm of science or to the realm of the phenomenal world, it remains true on my presuppositions that I do not comprehend them exhaustively. All the facts of the phenomenal world are incomprehensible to me precisely because they are what they are by virtue of the voluntary action of the will of God with respect to them. So there, a second time, he's emphasizing the voluntary character of God's creation. The minute you would say that God had to create a necessity of his own being, that he wasn't free not to create, then you would open up the possibility that therefore we share an ontology with God and an epistemology with God. We should be able to deduce then what is created. So we should be able to reason through why things are what they are. And Van Til there's kind of a hidden reductio here that obviously we can't do that, because as we confront creation, it's full of surprises and contingencies and things that we in no way could have deduced, thereby reflecting the freedom of God in having created them that way. Whether you're talking about an electron, like why is it that an electron is this object, we believe, an elementary particle that has spin 1/2 h bar, and it has a charge negative such and such, and a mass of 1.6 MeV, as I recall, or something like that. Why does it have those properties and not some other properties? Well, ultimately, this is because God made it that way. We can't penetrate any deeper than that. We don't really even know what it really is. We have these constants that we assign to it that allow us to predict behavior using formulas, but that's it. We can't get any further beyond that. When you push back the bottom line nature of the world around us, it's really all mysterious. Why does a piece of wood selected by the woodworker have a certain kind of beauty? How does he select tiger maple versus mahogany? Why are these two woods looking like that? Well, maybe biologists have figured out that the way the fibers respond to the seasonal variation of sunshine and snow and rain and so forth, perhaps there's something in their DNA, as it were, that creates patterns that we then, after cutting the tree down, makes it look like these patterns. But why does that strike us as beautiful? Why is it desirable for us? We can't say. So all of these are ways that I would try to unpack or elucidate his insistence that this creator-creature relationship has to be a voluntary one on God's part to account for the inexplicable and ultimately irrational, if you will, nature. By irrational, I don't mean anti-rational, but I just mean it's not something that could be deduced. They are what they are. They occupy a place in the scheme of things, spatio-temporal, because God, by his plan and by the execution of his plan in the works of creation and providence, makes them what they are. They are, in the last analysis, as incomprehensible to me as is God himself. My idea of the incomprehensibility of God, therefore, presupposes his true knowability. And his true knowability is based on the fact that I am his creature and that all things created are made by him. I could therefore not even assert the incomprehensibility of God unless I presuppose the knowability of God. Now that's interesting. So incomprehensible implies knowable. That's a very surprising result. And I think this is right at the heart of the Van Tilian metaphysic. We know nothing without this model of the creator-creature distinction and the nature of that radical distinction between creator and creature is expressed in terms of our knowledge by the term incomprehensible. But we wouldn't even apprehend God if he didn't reveal himself and make himself knowable. I cannot assert the knowability of anything in the phenomenal world unless I presuppose the knowability of God. It is therefore upon the idea that all phenomenal reality, whether within the mind of man or surrounding it, is what it is because of the result of the activity of the will of God as revelational of his character. Upon this I base the doctrine of the incomprehensibility of God. On page 250, there's two more paragraphs that Bahnsen includes, but I think they're continuing to make these same points, so I'll leave those for the listener to read in the interest of moving ahead here. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful. It was a very difficult passage. At least I found it quite difficult. But after kind of analyzing each section and each sentence in terms of this pair of models, the Christian view and the non-Christian view, a lot of the statements kind of snapped into place. I was going to include all of the readings from section 4.5 in this video, but as I've been sitting here editing it, I realized it's too long, too much for one sitting. So I'm cutting it off here. We'll finish the rest of the readings next time. See you then. Bye-bye.